Hello, everyone, and we are excited to inaugurate the 2022-2023 Hutchins Center Alumni Fellows Reading Series with Rita Fried and Tanya Saunders, both recent and illustrious fellows of our program. Rita Fried will be speaking on a forthcoming book on ancient Nubia. She received her BA from Wellesley College and her doctorate in Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern art and archaeology from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. She was Associate Professor of Art at the University of Memphis and founding director of the Institute of Egyptian Art and Archaeology before coming to the MFA at Boston to head the Department of Ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern Art, a position she now holds as Emerita. For several years now, she has also been teaching Egyptian and Nubian art at Wellesley College. Dr. Fried has excavated in Egypt at numerous sites from the Delta to Karnak, as well as in Israel and Cyprus. She has curated and co-curated many highly acclaimed exhibitions, including Egypt's Golden Age, A Divine Tour of Ancient Egypt, Ramesses the Great, Pharaohs of the Sun, The Secrets of Tomb 10A, and Ancient Nubia Now. Tanya Saunders will be in conversation with Rita Fried. Dr. Tanya L. Saunders is a sociologist and cultural studies scholar who is interested in how the African diaspora throughout the Americas uses the arts as a tool for social change through decolonizing systems of thinking and knowing in the Americas. Dr. Saunders was a Mammalian Fellow in 2022 here at Harvard University's Hutchins Center, where they began working on their second book, tentatively entitled Estetias do Bafo, Querying Black Brazilian Artivism and Politics of Liberation. They are currently an associate professor of Black expressive culture in the language, literacy, and cultural doctoral program at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Welcome, Rita and Tanya. Rita, would you begin by describing your project and then reading passages? And then Tanya, can you be in conversation with Rita? And after that, we will open it up to a Q&A session with the audience.
Hey, thank you, Krishna. And thank you to the Hutchins for the wonderful experience we all had last year as fellows, Tanya and I at least. By way of introduction, ancient Nubia is an empire that few people know about. And of course, for that reason, I am showing it to you on the screen. It comprises southern Egypt, beginning around Aswan, and continues south to Khartoum. Most of it is in Sudan. And it is both an ancient empire that goes back, say, 8,000 BC or so, and continued up until the 4th century CE. Now, very few people know that Nubia has more pyramids than Egypt, lasted longer than Egypt, has monuments as interesting as Egypt. And I'm here to, one of the reasons for doing my book is to make it better known. I think it's unknown or relatively little known for many reasons. One is that it's overshadowed by its neighbor to the north, i.e. Egypt, and it's not nearly as easily accessible. Moreover, we're not really exposed to its material culture, its objects, its art. And until recently, it wasn't all that well explored. So how did I come to it? Well, my years as curator of ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern art at the Museum of Fine Arts certainly exposed me to it. I could more say Nubia found me rather than I found Nubia. The Museum of Fine Arts has unquestionably the finest collection of ancient Nubian art outside of Sudan. And I do want to say that Nubia, I'm talking about ancient Nubia, which I ended about 350 BC when theoretically King Azana of Ethiopia came and Christianized it and ended the ancient empire, but Nubia very much still exists today. And the people of Nubia, both in Sudan and in every major city around the world, including Boston, uh, in uh, in many respects, continue the cultures of ancient Nubia, which is another fascinating topic for another lecture. But when I would lecture about Nubia in my capacity as curator, teachers in the audience would ask me for resources on ancient Nubia, resources they could teach from. Now, admittedly, there are coffee table books and there are scholarly tomes of more than 1,000 pages. Or I could send them on deep dives into the scholarly journals in French, German, English, and other languages. But otherwise, I was at a loss for something that they could grasp in the time they had. And I was especially at a loss to recommend something that really focused on the amazing and unique art and architecture of this region. So I decided that that was a contribution that I could make. And what I am in the process of working on is, I hope, a beautifully illustrated, accessible book that will make it easy for teachers to teach and students to use this. Something that will really show off the artistry of the ancient Nubians and make Nubia much more of a household word than it is. And I wanted to bring out personalities wherever I could. And so that's sort of the background of what I'll be doing today. So the section I will read is from a chapter where Nubia conquered Egypt around 725 BCE. So I will read a few pages from that. So around 800 BCE, after nearly half a century of Egyptian domination, a Nubian dynasty arose at the Nile's fourth cataract, an area known as Napata, and that's the area I've highlighted in blue here. It was a fertile stretch of the river far from Egypt's southern border and the southernmost point of Egyptian conquest. The Egyptians had been in control of Nubia for the 500 years previously. The second ruler of the Nubian dynasty, King Kashta, and perhaps even his predecessor Alara, commanded sufficient power and support to expand their hegemony into Egypt, at least as far north as Aswan, craftily seizing a moment of weakness in their northern neighbors, in their northern neighbor. But it wasn't until the third king of the Nubian dynasty, Pianki, whose conquest of all of Egypt gave rise to not only one of the largest empires of the ancient world, but one of the most creative periods on the Nile, namely Egypt's dynasty 25, also known as the Kushite dynasty, so called because Kush was the term used to designate Nubia by both the Nubians and the Egyptians. Conquest of an empire. When an army under the leadership of King Pianki marched into Egyptian territory around 743 BCE, it must have been a terribly strange and terrifying sight for the Egyptian populace. As Pianki relates on his stela, or commemorative stone, 6 feet high, 5,000 pounds, you see it here, it's in the Cairo Museum. As he relates, some Egyptian regional rulers, threatened by the expansionist plans of others, begged Pianki to come to Egypt to their aid. Now, not surprisingly, Egyptians do not mention this in their records because it certainly doesn't put them in a favorable light. King Pianki's arrival in Egypt ushered in a new era for both Nubia and Egypt, and with it, new styles in art and architecture, styles that combine past tradition with innovation. Although Napatan sculpture and architecture owes a lot to Egyptian conventions and even Egyptian artists, it's infused with a raw energy and creativity that is distinctly Nubian. By Pianki's time, and thanks to nearly half a millennium of past Egyptian colonization of Nubia, both countries had a lot in common. Nubians and Egyptians intermarried and exchanged ideas, technologies, and material goods. But most importantly, they shared a belief in the all-powerful god Amun. Amun, who first appears in Egypt around 2000 BC, where he's generally represented as a human male, as you see here, with a tall feather headdress. His Egyptian homeland was Karnak, a vast and extraordinary temple complex over 1,000 years old by the time Pianki ruled. By contrast, in Nubia, that same god, Amun, was usually represented as a ram or a human male with a ram's head, a reference to the importance of this powerful animal, which has been represented in Nubia for at least 1,000 years earlier than Pianki's rule. This shared belief in Amun, together with Pianki's astute insights into human nature, made him welcome in many Egyptian cities, or so he wants us to believe. After King Pianki subdued Egypt, he returned home to Napata to his family and his people, a homecoming that must have been a joyous celebratory event. And in commemoration of this victory, he embellished Napata's holiest site, Jebel Barcault, a 300-foot tall, awe-inspiring mountain that dominated an otherwise flat desert. A tall pinnacle in the front that you see here, semi-detached from the rest of the mountain, resembled a uraeus, that sacred cobra that entwined itself around the head of a king in order to spit its deadly venom at the king's enemies. A mountain considered sacred at least as early as the Egyptians' conquest of Nubia. The Egyptians were the ones who erected the first known temple there, and they identified the mountain as the birthplace of the shared god Amun. King Pianki, the Nubian king, enlarged this temple, erected the stela that you saw before, and further adorned the temple with sculpture he stole from temples the Egyptians had erected earlier in Nubia and put them up at Jebel Barcault. Well, tribute and booty accompanied victory in war, like it does today. And on his stela, Pianki relates that he received treasures from rulers of many Egyptian cities. Upon his return to Napata, it seems he generously passed this booty, these gifts, along to his wives, who numbered at least 6. From these wives, 3 sons and 6 daughters are known by name, but he likely had a lot more. King Pianki's gifts were so precious to his queens that they included them in their tombs, which, like many of the king's ancestors, were located at Kuru in the Napata region. The wives' tombs were marked by low mounds known as tumuli, a form of burial common in Nubia for at least 5,000 years at that time, and these queens' tombs were located, interestingly enough and uniquely, in a dedicated section of the cemetery set apart from the rest by a wadi or dry riverbed. This special location and the richness of the tombs are 2 of the many elements attesting to the importance of queens in Nubian culture. The tombs were excavated between 1918 and 1919 by the Harvard University Museum of Fine Arts expedition. And in them, the expedition found many fascinating objects that are likely a combination of both locally made items and gifts brought back from Egypt. A cultural mix. In many instances, it's not possible to tell the difference between native Nubian and imported objects, but in other cases, the origins appear clear. So, for example, an object likely made in Egypt is this head of Hathor, the goddess Hathor, goddess of love, fertility, and motherhood, on top of a perfect crystal ball. At just over 1 inch tall, it's also one of the smallest objects. A queen of Pianki's would have worn it around her neck, suspended from a loop in the back. Its drilled center, which you can see here, likely once held an amulet. The goldwork techniques, a mixture of cast and hammered elements soldered together, have no precedent in earlier Nubian works, which seldom, by the way, featured human representations. Moreover, crystal objects were far more common in the Mediterranean regions. The Hathor crystal's size make it very portable, and its beauty made it highly desirable. Nothing about it suggests that it was made in Nubia, although the gold itself may have come from there. In contrast, many of the queen's tombs contained a unique and varied series of amulets, which were likely made locally based on their material, design, and symbols. They're made of faience, a material that's silica and lime heated with a colorant, which is generally fragile material, made even more fragile when composed of narrow elements with spaces in between, or a sort of open work way of manufacture, as many of them are. Faience, moreover, had a long tradition in Nubia, and its fragility would have made it very difficult to transport over long distances. And this trip between Egypt and Napata would have taken a good 2 months. Moreover, these items are composed of a complex, often unparalleled variety of motifs. And this aesthetic continued to define Nubian style for the next 1,000 years. Most significantly, Napatan artists put together diverse elements, rich in symbolism and often of Egyptian origin, but they did so in a way that was meaningful to them, but would have seemed bizarre to the Egyptians. For example, this is Ptaikos, a god who wards off evil. In Egypt, he's usually depicted as a squatting dwarf with a human head. In this Nubian example, he has 4 wings and a ram's head, like the Nubian depiction of Amun. In our next example, an ujat eye, or magic eye, also faience, is another example of what I believe is a Nubian style object. The magic of the eye is heightened by the addition of snakes with wings, a winged scarab clutching a rosette in its hind legs, and a squatting baboon, all designed to ensure rebirth in the afterlife and symbolic of the sun. This really crowded combination of elements in which the framework of the eye itself is practically lost remains a common style in Marowitic Nubian arts hundreds of years later. Winged elements, as seen in both the ujat eye and the Ptaikos, are a frequent motif from the Kerma period on, that is about 1,000 years earlier. And nowhere is that more beautifully expressed than in an amulet featuring a goddess whose downturned wings are meant to be viewed as if they extended forward in a protective embrace. Further, she displays an early example of how the Nubians expressed beauty and power through a voluptuous body with large breasts, a narrow waist, and certainly curvaceous hips. The goddess's round face and neatly tufted hair are also immediately identifiable as Nubian. In another example, the head of a lioness, the ultimate symbol of power, takes the place of her human head. In these and similar amulets, such aspects as the way the human figure is depicted, the innovative combination of elements, their complexity, and the omnipresence of the ram show the beginnings of a uniquely Nubian aesthetic. Women of the Kushite dynasty. Records indicate that royal women enjoyed unprecedented power, at least by the time of the Napatan rulers of Dynasty 25, at least by the time they rose to power, and likely much earlier. While it's difficult to excavate a personality from an archaeological records, in the case of Pianki's Queen Kensa, the unique material passed over by ancient robbers provides some clues. Queen Kensa, my favorite, was a collector. During her long life, perhaps 50 years or more, she must have taken long walks in the desert around Napata, where she collected over 40 small, colorful, naturally polished pebbles of, among other materials, porphyry, alabaster, flint, amethyst, and agate. Oddly shaped, often conjoined pebbles also interested her, and in one case, she even embellished one with gold bands, as you see here. The top of one globular piece of alabaster was carved into a tiny head. I know nothing else like it. Kensa's interests extended to models of living things as well. Her tomb included a steatite volute shell inscribed in hieroglyphs with a prayer to the goddess Mut, wife of Amun, And she also had a glazed stone sand grouse, a fossil sea urchin, an ivory elephant, a stone pomegranate, and a faience lotus bud, each less than an inch high. Apparently, she was especially fond of miniature objects. Like most of her Kushite peers, Kensa liked jewelry. Hundreds of round and barrel-shaped gold beads, as well as red carnelian and blue faience beads, also numbering in the hundreds, once formed elegant and colorful necklaces. Queen Kensa had a taste for the exotic. In addition to many more likely locally made objects, Queen Kensa also had two jugs, one alabaster and one quartzite. And what you see here is they're one of them with a trefoil, or that is three-lobed rim. The shape is not a Nubian shape. It's not an Egyptian shape. Rather, it's traceable to the Phoenicians of the Mediterranean world, and the material itself, alabaster, is traceable to Egypt. But Kensa's name is carved in Egyptian hieroglyphs around the body of the vase, so there's no doubt about the ownership. Bone fragments in the debris of her tomb were all that was left of her mortal remains. The presence of canopic jars and eyes from a coffin suggest her body was prepared in Egyptian fashion, but her burial was Kushite. Like her ancestors who were buried on beds, her coffin was placed on a raised podium whose four corners had cutouts for bed legs. Based on what was left in her tomb, Kensa was a cosmopolitan woman with clearly defined tastes. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Rita. As you know, I'm a big fan of your work. I was so happy to have the opportunity during the fellowship to learn about your research, and now to have this opportunity to see how it is evolving and to get even more information about your research. So I guess for me, I'm going to focus on three areas before we open it up to everyone that's present. And that is, I'm interested in the political implications of your research. Broadly speaking, could be within your area of, within your fields specifically, or just in generally in terms of knowledge that we have about how we tend to map the origins of even the Western world, right? Some people will go back as far as Egypt, but I'm just interested in the political implications of your work. The second is culture, and the third is gender. But just kind of starting with this political question, why has it been started to be explored more recently? What are the political implications of your work? And what does it mean for how we understand the ancient world?
Oh, good questions. Tanya, I think it's complicated, and there are a lot of things that play into it. I think there is no doubt in my mind that the Black Lives Matter movement really made people take notice of things we've neglected. And ancient Nubia is certainly one of them. But I think that's not the whole story. I think there's ironically, thanks to an infusion of money into excavation in Sudan, there's been a lot more work there recently. Professors have taken students. The material is becoming better published, better known. The problem, as I said, is that it's better known in obscure journals, but not necessarily for the general public. I think that I find it appalling that when I teach, for example, a class of college students and ask what people know about Nubia, they know very little. And this is true of the general public. I think we have done Nubia an injustice, and granted, Egypt's pyramids are taller than Nubia's pyramids, but there are more cultures in Africa, many more, that deserve the same kind of attention. And I'd like to hope that the world in this sense is changing a little bit for the better, and that a lot of people are doing what they can to make Nubia more of a household word. And I sincerely hope that the material will be taught in schools. It deserves to be. It deserves to be, well, part of world history in much more of a way than it is now. And you're absolutely right that we may spend a day or two teaching about Egypt, showing the pyramids. It's far more to Egypt than the pyramids, and then move right on to Greece and the origins of Western civilization, which we really now know is not the case at all.
Yeah, and so just thinking about the question about culture, I found it fascinating that you kind of pointed to that the people of Nubia today still engage in cultural practices that are ancient in origin. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. I have to say, this comes from the Nubian friends I have had the privilege of getting to know through the objects, through their curiosity and interest in their ancient heritage. So, for example, of course, the Nubians today are Muslim for the most part. And Muslims, burial customs, I should say, this concerns burial customs, are one of the most ingrained cultural traits you can have. When most Muslims are brought to the tomb, the coffin is carried under a white shroud. When Nubian burials are when a deceased Nubian is brought to the tomb, he or she is brought on a bed. The bed is not included in the tomb, but this custom of bed burial goes back to 2000 BC. No other Islamic culture or any other culture I know of brings a body to the tomb on a bed. I think also the love of color. When we look at many Nubian objects, they're sandstone because that's the local stone and there's no paint on them. But we know from traces of paint that we're now able to find that they were brilliant in yellows, reds, and that what we see today, of course, is only a fraction of that. We know this, as I said, from trace elements. And one of the things to me that distinguishes Nubian women is their love of color. And in many similar societies, women are dressed in black, but not so in Nubia. Their toubes are just have almost iridescent colors and beautiful patterning. And I think this is also something that's a continuation. I think there are also other ceremonies and insignia that some of my Nubian friends have pointed out. So I think there are similarities in games. There are similarities in the Nubians. I was going to say they're known for they were known anciently for their ability in war, and I think that's probably still the case. But there are a number of things, and I think this is more a field for the anthropologists than it is for me. It's dangerous to say because it happened 4,000 years ago and you still see it today that there's the continuation, but it is definitely still true that there are continuities. Mm-hmm. And the identity as Nubian is very strong.
This is fascinating. And I just think that as somebody that's just interested in the politics surrounding the mapping of history, knowledge, culture, how we come to know who we are, and the stories that we tell about how we become or became who we are as a people, right? Whether it's a nation or whatever, I think it's fascinating. And I think it's oftentimes for those of us that are Afro-descendant, you know, that story is a shorter story, but when you just have these opportunities to kind of make those connections to thousands of years, right, and to have that documented, it's just so much that, you know, hopefully when we see each other again soon, we can talk more about. But for today, before I go into the question about gender, could you talk a little bit about what specifically is a Nubian aesthetic?
As I see it, the Nubians, first of all, Nubia felt no need. The earliest, other than stone tools, the earliest material we have from Nubia is ceramics. And some of these ceramics are so abstract in shape that, first of all, they look very contemporary, but their decoration is so complex. Their decoration either done with pebbles or maybe fish bones or a comb is complex and beautifully integrated. And this desire to decorate, often an overall really harmonious decoration, I think continues throughout Nubian culture, ancient Nubian culture. I think that also the manner of depicting depicting humans, we don't really, well, let me go before that, because the human depiction really starts in earnest around the 8th century BC. But before that, we have the Nubians were very much lived in their environment, and they could capture their environment in a way that very few other cultures did. So, for example, in a simple kind of object like an inlay, we see animals in flight. We see imaginary animals. We see that they truly capture the essence of what a bird or a giraffe or any of the other animals they depicted, a turtle, for example. They really knew these animals and captured them. The stalking of a fox, or the awkwardness of an elephant, we see that early on. And when they depict, there's a whole different sense of beauty, as I alluded to. And when size equals power. And the more, both from the 8th century BC through the end of ancient Nubia, the bigger you were, the more powerful you were. And that was true for kings as well as queens. And I think again, I keep coming back to this desire to decorate. When we look at some of the later Nubian material, and by the way, I should certainly mention there are colossal statues of Nubian kings and queens that go well beyond the topic here. But when you look at some of the depictions on Nubian temple walls, there is not an inch of space of these textiles, of the garments they wear, that is not decorated. So to me, this harmonious but full sense, this desire to decorate, this harmonious sense of what works well together, and the sense of size equaling power, and making a statement through their art, and also making it, for want of a better expression, in your face. There is no doubting what is represented. Egyptian material, not to compare it to Egyptian, but that's what people unfortunately know best. Egyptian art is more obscure. You need to it's not as immediately graspable as Nubian. In many of the Nubian temples, the figures fill the height of the temple. The hieroglyphs, or the language, by the way, the language wasn't written until about 300 BC, although it was certainly spoken more than 1,000 years earlier, but they didn't need to write it down. What you have on the temples were over life-size images of gods, over life-size images of kings and queens. And that was the message, the relationship between the kings and the gods and the queens and the gods. You didn't need to read the stuff. So it's much more, in my mind, it's much more direct than it is in Egypt.
Well,
So
that's a
short answer.
no, that's a perfect lead into the last kind of theme or questions that I had about gender. And just before the general question about gender, I'm really fascinated in thinking about learning more about the relationship between these queens and their goddesses, right? You mentioned Hathor and Mut, and what is the relationship that Kensa has to Mut? So I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about that in terms of just how we tend to think about gender today. So the relationship between those two, and then the other question is just kind of, are the queens the way that, are their genders the way that we would imagine queens today? Or, were they warriors? Did their gender have anything to do with their relationship to the goddesses? Or just, yeah, if you could talk a bit about that. I was curious about those relationships.
My first answer is I wish I knew more. I wish we knew more. Because there's not as much, because the Nubian kings and queens first wrote in hieroglyphs, they tended just to write formulaically. So they don't, the king, in Egypt, at least, the office of kingship was divine, and similarly the office of queenship. But we can't say that it was the same in Nubia. And we don't, when Nubian material is finally written down in about 300 BC, in the language we call Marowitic, we have yet to be able to translate it. So this is just an example of all the work that needs to be done on this ancient culture. I mean, we need to translate the language first. But there, in terms of gender roles, what is clear is that kings and queens seem to have been equal. They're on one famous temple of about 10 BC. The king is shown on the facade smiting enemies. The king takes up the whole facade of the pylon. On the other, that's on one side. On the other side, his queen is exactly the same size and does exactly the same thing. She smites a whole pile of enemies, and we don't get similar things on temple walls in Egypt, for example. So we know that queens had played a greater role. And in another instance, a queen, there were queens who ruled on their own without male counterparts. And in one instance, there was a widow who went on to defeat the Roman garrison in Aswan, and was able to carry away the head of the Roman Emperor Augustus, buried it underneath the threshold of a temple at Merowe, so that every time you stepped on that threshold, you stepped on the head of Augustus. I mean, they knew symbolism. Of course, Roman rulers don't put her in a very good light, but she must have been one powerful lady to lead a whole army. And by the way, there was later a truce that was established between the Romans and the people of Nubia, and it really wasn't broken. The peace wasn't broken. So the Romans never conquered Nubia. They tried, but they couldn't do it. So Nubia remained free while Egypt was under Roman control, and that was in part due to the queen.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. And I think I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to Krishna.
Sure. Thank you both. Audience members are welcome to indicate that they have questions or comments by raising the raise hand icon. But until that happens, Let me convey a question from someone in the audience who asks, who says, please tell us more about Queen Kensha, what she collected when she walked around Napatan, and she's fascinating, the audience member says.
I agree. I think she's completely fascinating. Well, what we have from her tomb is this great, and again, her tomb was plundered, so we don't have the full picture. What I didn't tell you about what she had were a number of silver vessels, a number of purely enigmatic, excuse me, enigmatic objects whose function we don't know. What might have been something used in her mummification. But these pebbles, it's as if there's a game played today that where kids make little holes in the ground and they have pebbles that move from hole to hole. And maybe this was a game, this was part of a game that she chose to take with her. But she was clearly fascinated by small objects and objects of color. And again, this is, as far as I know, unprecedented in terms of this. I think these are things the robbers left behind because they were of no use to the robbers. But this variety of materials and variety of a variety of types of objects, particularly the natural objects that I listed. She lived to be at least, according to her remains, she was at least 50 years old, which was relatively old for a Nubian queen. And she was also a queen of Pianki, so she must have enjoyed considerable status as any queen would have. But I have to tell you, when I was in Sudan walking in the desert, near one of the sites, I happened to kick up one of these conjoined pebbles. And what did I do? I reached down and I picked it up because it was just fun to hold. So I like to think of Queen Kensa as one of us, as somebody who liked jewelry, who liked color, who was fascinated by the natural world, no different from many of us today. I wish we knew more about her. I wish there were more that we could tell, but who knows? Maybe we will find out more.
Thank you. I believe Gloria has a question.
Unmute. Okay, I have 3 questions, but very quick. Unmute. The first is, are you hearing me well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good. So I want to know whether the Museum of Fine Arts, and I know this is a more general question, whether it has changed its ways. Is it now including Nubia and Egypt in its African collections? Because it hasn't done that in the past. It has done some segregated exhibits. So that's one. But, this is more for the administration, but still. The second question is about the, when you talked about Nubian aesthetics, you mentioned, how graphic and so on, you would have representation. My question is this, and immediately, whilst you were describing this, my mind went to Diodorus Siculus, who actually says about the same thing and added that the Nubians were the originators of hieroglyphics. So my question is, what do you think about Diodorus Siculus and that view? And the third is a quick comment. You mentioned that, the Egyptians had taller pyramids, and by implication, probably, more majestic and whatnot. But what about angles? One is doing a pyramid at an angle of 57 degrees, generally, or 50 something. The other at 70 and thereabouts. And I think when we compare pyramids, we've got to look at that. And also, not imply that the taller, the better. Thank you very much.
Well, lots of things to talk to you about. I think as far as the MFA is concerned, I can't really speak because I am only Emerita at this point. I have no power at the MFA. I will say that the Nubian objects are all available. Well, let me start differently. There was a show called Ancient Nubia Now right before the pandemic, and we were very fortunate. There was a Nubia gallery in the museum, a dedicated gallery between 1992 and 2006. And then the museum reconfigured things and had plans to reinstall the Nubian material. I remain hopeful that this will happen. And I urge you to let the museum know that you're interested in the Nubian material, because I think they listen. I think that they're now in a period of transition, and I think they are recognizing the power of this material and its ability to enchant audiences of all over. And it's something special that they have that nobody else outside of Sudan has. And I would like to think that in the coming years, it will not only be shown, but be shown appropriately in the space it deserves. And I can tell you that that is my fervent hope. Meanwhile, I think that what I can do is to write this book so that people can find the material accessible and come to understand it and enjoy its beauty. Now, as far as Diodorus Siculus is concerned and the origin of hieroglyphs, I'm not sure where he got this statement. He certainly could have been exposed to Marowitic hieroglyphs, which Marowitic, the language that was written down from about 300 BCE on. We have hieroglyphs in Egypt that are much earlier. I think that, I don't know what to call it, but orality is so important in up until today in all of Africa, I can't say all of Africa, in much of Africa, and also in the Islamic world. When I meet people, they tell me, well, they're descended from Muhammad, and they can they can literally by heart trace their ancestry back. And I'd like to think that this, and with something like that, who needs to write it down? I think that the Nubians developed writing of their own writing, or they put their own language into writing when they needed to. And that is when Merowe became a real hub of, like one of the great centers of the Silk Route, for example. When Merowe became a real hub of trade, and I'm talking about trade with the classical world, trade with Egypt, but also, and this is something I think we really are finding out much more about, and this is one of the great frontiers of research, trade with West Africa through wadis or dry riverbeds and flooded lakes, and also trade with the Red Sea. So trade in all directions. With that kind of interaction, you need a language, a written language, a way to keep records. So I think that Diodorus must have been thinking of something else, but to date we have no writing that in the native language that predates about 300 BC. The earlier writing, when the Nubians wrote, they wrote in Egyptian hieroglyphs. And as far as the angles of the pyramids and the size of the pyramids, I couldn't agree with you more. The Nubian pyramids are very distinctive. There are some precedents in Egypt for this, for the very steep slope of the pyramids, in terms of private pyramids, but in terms of the numbers of pyramids and their juxtaposition to one another, it's as if the pyramids themselves in some places form their own village. That community was so important. I think that I think that my allusion to Egypt was just to say people are familiar with Egypt, not that, and Egypt from Europe is easier to get to. But that the Nubian pyramids are exquisite and well deserve to be visited and better known. So I hope that answers your questions.
Thank you. Yvonne, do you still have a question?
Thank you. I would just like to build on Gloria's question. And I apologize for making you the spokesperson for the MFA, but their permanent African collections are Egypt and the Kingdom of Benin. You cannot find, I can't find Nubia outside of traveling collections that come and go. So your comment about the museum having the largest collection of Nubian artifacts outside of the Sudan was very surprising. So again, you're not a spokesperson for the MFA, but would you comment on why Benin, as opposed to Nubia, has such a central place in the public collection at the Museum of Fine Arts?
My first answer is I wish I knew. It's in part because all but 5 of those Benin objects are owned by a private collector. And I think that there was a hope that they be given to the museum. And of course, Benin is very problematic. And many countries are returning Benin objects to Nigeria or where the original Benin Kingdom was located. I think it was space is what is the most precious thing in the museum, and I think when I think the director at the time made the decision to give the space to this collection in hopes that it would come to the museum. And I can only repeat that the museum has the capacity to really educate and show off this spectacular material, colossal in scale, in tonnage, fragile in many cases, but I should also add that when you're showing something like a 16-ton sarcophagus, you can't just put it on the floor that falls through. You have to have a special, it's difficult to show this material in the sense that you need structural steel weight distribution platforms. It needs special conservation. It needs the museum to invest in this and make it a priority. And that's why I say, I think every one of us can play a role in expressing a desire to see it and not in a special exhibition. And to see it in all its glory with the colossal statues of kings as well as the small and precious gold objects. So I can't urge you enough to help us all get that out.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another illustrious alum fellow, Sinclair Bell, has a question. He says, as you look at Nubian interactions with the Romans, if you are in your book, hopefully, I am curious if you have settled on a particular way of thinking about objects that sit at the intersection of those two particular cultures, for instance, hybridity, creolization. In my own experience, Roman itself is such an elastic category, and it can be difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish between where one ends and the other begins.
Sinclair, I think we need to talk more about this. I think, you know, there are some objects, as we both know, that are clearly Roman imports. Those fabulous Roman lamps, or the cup that from the time, the silver goblet from the time of Augustus. But yet, when I think of something like Marowitic pottery, I think of vine scrolls that are right out of the classical world, but then I think of a crocodile chomping on another crocodile right above that. That's, I think the people of the later people of Nubia, the people of Merowe, had a real sense of humor. And I think that really comes through on their pottery. I think that they definitely do take Roman motifs or classical motifs and use them when they think it's appropriate, but then don't hesitate to add their own. And I think that's probably true of every culture that has this hybridity. And I don't think, you know, I think, in my own opinion, the people of Merowe must have been fascinated by Roman culture, just like the people of Rome must have been fascinated by Marowitic culture, their way of collecting water in these vast water collection areas that would nothing like it in the Roman world. And I think another example is the so-called baths of Merowe, and classical style sculptures with Nubian proportions that would find no home anywhere else in the Roman, or would find no home in the Roman world, but were clearly influenced by Rome, but with that Nubian stamp. And I think it is a real, I think it is a fascinating area, but I think Rome was not the only influence on Merowe. And I think another thing that really remains to be explored are the other African influence, or I should say Rome is not Africa. Well, Rome, Northern Africa is Roman. But I should say that there are many influences from elsewhere in Africa on late and probably earlier Nubian civilization that we have yet to uncover, and many people are searching for those links. So does that answer?
Yeah, no, it's really helpful, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Maybe one last question from me. There is interest in Nubia in hip hop culture, and young people in general seem to know about Nubia and are interested in its history. How do you think these two areas of interest, hip hop and youth, can be helpful in bringing Nubian art and history to the forefront?
Well, Krishna, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think one of the ways Nubia resonates for a young generation is through hip hop lyrics, through brand Nubian or Les Nubiennes, which are hip hop groups. But what was made clear to me through one of the Hutchins hip hop fellows was that in hip hop culture, Nubia signifies Blackness, it signifies beauty, it signifies power. And all those are, as I understand it, intertwined with the origins of hip hop. And in fact, if you Google Nubia, you will probably not find a long discourse on King Pianki, but you will see a whole line of beauty products. that are synonymous with Nubia. And there's also a Wonder Woman Nubia, which is Wonder Woman's sister. So it's there. I think that there is always, well, my understanding from African-American friends is that there's always been an understanding of some kind of powerful culture there that is part of African-American, particularly consciousness today. And I think that's a topic that some of my colleagues are working on, and I think we'll find it absolutely fascinating. Like, for example, Nubian Square in Boston, 2019, when we had the Nubian exhibition in at the museum, is when Dudley Square, named after an early governor of Massachusetts who had slaves, became Nubian Square. And the local Nubian population is very proud to claim this as their own, although it may have had to do with a store that was called the Nubian Notion, which was a sort of general store in that area for a long time. So I think these things are all so wonderfully intertwined. So from 8000 BC until today, that's not bad.
It's not bad at all. Well, thank you both for a wonderful conversation, and thank you also to our audience for their contribution and for coming.